Oh, no. Backdoor. Wow. That's way off.
And he takes, wow.
There are a handful of players in the MLB that seem to have pissed off umpires enough to get screwed time and time again.
No.
Are umpires holding a grudge against these players? Did they kiss the umpire's sister?
Is that your sister out there in left field, naked?
Or what if all of this is wrong? What if you're being told that it's a ball when it's actually a strike? Buckle up. This is going to be a serious baseball mind. Have you ever had days where you feel like the world is picking on you? You hit every red light, you keep encountering nothing but rude people, nothing is going good enough for your boss, or worse, your wife?
Lay off me, I'm starving!
Well, so do these 6 very lucky players in the MLB. One difference, they haven't felt this way for one day, they've felt like this for the last 3 years. So here's the scoop. An article from Cubs reporter Shahadev Sharma of The Athletic was released recently, and it noted that since 2022, Wilmer Flores and Seiya Suzuki are number 1 and number 2 in the league with over 6.5% of balls being called strikes. In other words, 1 out of every 15 pitches thrown for a ball is actually called a strike to these 2 guys. Not far behind them are Isaac Paredes, Mark Canha, and Steven Kwan. All are tied for 3rd in this unfortunate category at 5.8%. But this is based on Sharma's prerequisite of seeing at least 2,500 pitches outside of the zone since 2022. If we change that prereq to just 250 pitches less, you find Robbie Grossman leading the way by a landslide at 7.4% of the time. So this got me thinking, is this just bad luck? I mean, it could be, but 3 years of bad luck, that's a lot. Or is there something that maybe these players are doing to attract more strikes to be called? Maybe they're doing something with their stance, their body language, or are they just being too nice? Aww. But after doing a crap ton of research, I think it's none of that. I think these 6 players are actually getting a ton of strikes when the box on the TV is telling us that they're balls.
Say what?
Now, before I prove my point, let's eliminate the things that can't be proven. First, bad luck. Well, we can't measure bad luck. Just ask the 1909 to 2015 Cubs. No one knows why outside of a cursed goat, it took them 108 years to win their next World Series. So that's out. Number 2, the niceness factor. In Sharma's article, he references Todd Helton and how every time a strike was called, Todd was always asking the umpire, are you sure that's a strike? Why is that a strike? He had them thinking every single time. We can't really measure niceness either. Plus, they might have just been intimidated by that manly goatee. So really, there's no proof behind any of this. So how about stance? In Sharma's article, he mentions height. Tall players and short players seem to get screwed. That's definitely the possibility for Kwan. He's only 5'9", but the other 5, I don't think so. Suzuki and Paredes are 5'11", Canha and Flores are 6'2", and Robbie Grossman is 6 foot, all of those being pretty average for the league. But in Sharma's article, Ian Happ makes a really good reference to the setup, and I think we can measure the stance and the setup of a stance. Let's take a look. First, we need to know the definition of the MLB strike zone. Here it is. The official strike zone is the area over home plate from the midpoint between a batter's shoulders and the top of the uniform pants when the batter is in his stance and prepared to swing at a pitched ball, and at a point just below the kneecap.
You said who and what now?
Summarizing that to take away the important parts, the top of the zone is the midpoint of the batter's shoulders and belt, which honestly seems pretty subjective, but you can pretty much guess that's right around the lower part of the chest. And the bottom is right at the kneecap. The width, of course, is the 17 inches of home plate, and the last very important part is that it's determined before the pitch is delivered. So that leads you to wonder, are these batters dramatically changing their stance as the pitch is being delivered? And if they are, would the strike zone that we see on TV be potentially based on the wrong part of the stance? And just how accurate is that box that we see on the TV anyway? All these questions can get answered just by looking at each player's stance. We're going to start with Seiya Suzuki since he was the subject of Sharma's article. Pretty upright, arms stretched out, elbows up high, but as soon as the pitcher begins to deliver the pitch, Suzuki goes from upright to a much more crouched and athletic stance. Take a look at how much changes from the start of his stance to his ready stance. Both his head and torso are a lot further down, but maybe that's something that everyone does. So let's look at his teammate Cody Bellinger. Bellinger is also very upright, his elbows are high, his torso gets extended, but as soon as the pitch comes, his ready position does not hardly change from his starting position. And notice the difference in the length of each zone. Yes, Bellinger is 5 inches taller than Seiya Suzuki, but this looks like a much bigger difference than 5 inches if you ask me. I'm not buying say a zone here. And once again, the MLB rule leads us to believe that however the batter starts is where the strike zone should be. And now that we look at the K zone or the TV box, does that really look like the kneecaps to the middle of the torso? Definitely not. Now this might also be due to the fact that the camera behind center field is so high up, so the perspective of the camera angle is definitely at an angle. But using some reason and an eye test, I think we can still find out a pretty decent version of the strike zone for a correct length. All right, for this part, I want to actually show you my work because I think if I were to just show you the end result, that would be like baking the cake without actually showing you the ingredients that were all involved, and that can be really confusing. So I'm going to start right here by just comparing strike zones, right? When you look at this, does this strike zone right here look the same to you as this one? Absolutely not. This is a box, almost a perfect square, while this one is more of a rectangle. Now, again, we are looking at an angle, so that could be part of it. However, I think that if we just go ahead and adjust this based on where the actual strike zone is supposed to be, the chest, and then the bottom of the kneecap, we could probably figure something out here. So what I'm doing first is I'm just going to show you these lines. And there's a reason I've made this strike zone red for Suzuki, because we're actually going to start manipulating this strike zone itself. But as you can see, the current strike zone goes to basically the middle of his buttocks, and then the bottom of the shin, kind of the middle of the shin. And so I'm just going to very simply, guys, I'm going to move those two lines up to be where it's supposed to be based on looking at this as my model. Now, when I do that, I have to also move that box up. And as you can see, it's not even touching. It's not even coming close to where it should be as a strike zone for that rectangular kind of area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to extend that red box. I'm going to move it up, and now it's going to match both of those lines. So by matching both of these lines, what do we see? We see something that is very similar to what's on the left-hand side here, a rectangle, not a box. And in doing this, we then move it back down, and now look at the difference here. Look at how much space is actually here that is potentially being called a strike correctly, that the box on our TV is telling us is not a strike. And as we watch high strike after high strike after high strike for Suzuki here, you'll see that the new strike zone is actually showing these to be strikes. Now let's compare this to his teammate Cody Bellinger one more time. Here we go. You're looking at the current strike zone as it stands, and maybe a little bit better than Suzuki's, slightly below the kneecap and right at the belt, where Suzuki's was a little bit further down than that. So when we make the adjustment, now we're only moving it up a little bit to the kneecap and then to the middle of the torso. And of course, that box, not nearly as big of a discrepancy as Suzuki's. When we extend that box, here's what it looks like, and then we move it down to where it's supposed to be. And look, it's actually very similar to the TV box. And once again, the theory here is that because Bellinger has an upright stance and keeps that upright stance on his first move, that box is correctly showing the strike zone that we expect it to be, because it's the start of his stance, where Suzuki's is seeming to be compared to the first move after his stance has started. Now, I want to take this one step further, and I want to look at StatCast, see if this is a little bit more accurate. Okay, here is the new strike zone once again, and we've kind of narrowed the lines down a little bit on it so it's not as bold, so it makes a little bit more sense. You can see exactly what's going on here. The new one is the red one, and the old one is the white one. Big difference there. Let's add in StatCast, and look at this. As we put the StatCast line, which, by the way, once again, one of these pitches, I can't remember which one, it was called a strike in this at-bat, but because of where you see that the original TV zone was, everyone watching TV, including Boog and JD, oh my gosh, egregious, I can't believe they called it a strike. But as you can see, the actual StatCast one shows that it's a strike, but there's this tiny little bit of discrepancy. Let's just call it maybe a couple inches, if we were to zoom in, above the StatCast strike zone. Now, am I saying my strike zone is correct? I don't know. But what I can do is I can show you what it looks like compared to Cody Bellinger's. And Cody Bellinger's, if we notice, let's remove the StatCast one for a second. There's the new one. There's the StatCast one. It's the exact same. So based on Bellinger's strike zone and the perceived strike zone that I made in red and the StatCast strike zone, my train of thought on this is correct. However, on Suzuki's, there's a difference. Why is there a difference? I don't know, but all I can tell you is that this is leading me to wonder if some of these balls that are being called strikes are indeed strikes. But what I definitely know is that you can't trust that little white box that's on your TV.
Did I not clearly explain the circle of trust to you?
But this is just one player. What about the other 5? Looking at the other 5, we see that they all have pretty dramatic first moves once the ball is being delivered. All of their bodies crouch down, making their starting stance much different than their ending stance. So if we use the same method I showed you with Suzuki, here are the TV boxes, and then the more likely strike zone boxes on top of it based on the eye test that we did, same as the one that we did with Suzuki. I'm going to fill in the gap for you so you can see just how much of a difference there is. For guys like Robbie Grossman, lower right-hand corner, you can see that the new addition to the strike zone is probably about 50 to 60% bigger than the original one. And then if we throw the StatCast version over the new version as well, you can see for Kwan, Canna, and Grossman, there's still a little bit of a discrepancy. There's still some difference in the gap there, but there's not for Flores and Paredes. Now, I'm not quite sure why this method of this eye test and this adjustment that I made works on some but not on others, but I think the biggest thing that it tells us is that there is discrepancy on the perception of what the top of the strike zone is. But what about the other side of this coin? The guys from 2022 to 2024 that don't have many balls being called strikes. Do these players have stances that are more consistent from the start to the ready position that would therefore make their TV box and StatCast box closer in their dimensions? Looking at Baseball Savant, here are the top 10 leaders in this category of players with the lowest ratio of balls outside of the zone that are being called strikes. Now, this list needs to be taken with a grain of salt. If a player is well respected and has a long tenure of doing damage in the league, umpires tend to be nicer to those batters. I call this the Barry Bonds effect. He rarely had pitches on the edges that went against him. So this means Salvador Perez, Bryce Harper, Corey Seager, Rafael Devers, they all need to be removed from this list. And if a batter swings at a lot of pitches, they probably aren't going to have too many called strikes because they're always up there hacking. I call this the Javi Baez effect. And guess what? Baez is on this list, along with CJ Abrams, Michael Harris, Josh Naylor, Tim Anderson. These guys have some of the lowest pitches per plate appearance in the league. So really, that just leaves Rowley and McMahon as legitimate comps for this test. But I'd like to get at least a third comp, so I'm going to add number 14 on this list, Brandon Lau. Like Rowley and McMahon, he's had some success, but he's definitely not a Bryce Harper type, and he's seen plenty of pitches per at-bat. And just as we thought, these 3 batters move very slightly from their original stance to their ending stance. McMahon moves the most of these 3, but even his movement is slight compared to the Suzukis and the Floreses of the world. And as we look at their TV strike zone compared to their StatCast strike zone, on the left you see McMahon, Lau, and Rowley, and you can see that the gap there is pretty small compared to on the right-hand side where you see Grossman and Kwan. Now there's still discrepancy, and that's part of the point of what I'm making, is that the TV box is not accurate. But you can see by having a more consistent stance from start to finish, you have more similarities in the TV box compared to StatCast. Long story short, Suzuki, Paredes, Flores, Canna, Kwan, Grossman, we have thought all of the strikes at the top of the zone were actually balls, when in reality, most of them are strikes. Or the other side of it, maybe the MLB rule of the strike zone is too subjective, so technology and umpires are really not on the same page. You tell me, what do you think? So while I think this answers the question of why high strikes are getting called, it does not address the pitches off the plate. A few theories on this one. It could be body language, it could be their setup and how close they are to the plate, or maybe it's the number of pitches per plate appearance. Again, process of elimination here. Let's start with body language. I'm basically wondering, does a player consistently look like they are attracting strikes in their body language? Here's a montage of players taking a strike on a 3-0 pitch. Everyone in the stadium, plus the millions watching on TV, knows what's going to happen. They're going to rest the bat on their shoulders and not even think of swinging. So is it possible that these groups of players are inadvertently doing the same in different counts earlier in the at-bat? For guys like Suzuki and Flores, sure, it kind of looks like that. But Paredes, Canna, Grossman, and Kwan all look relatively similar in taking pitches on 0 strikes compared to 1 or 2 strike counts. So it's possible that it's hurting Suzuki and Flores, and maybe they should try to look a little more competitive even when they don't intend on swinging. But I don't think there's enough proof to really call that an answer. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. How about their distance to home plate? If they're closer to the plate, maybe more strikes will be called on the outside. I think of Anthony Rizzo when we bring up this theory. It always seemed like the strike zone was 3 inches wider when Rizzo was at the plate because he basically stood on the inside of the batter's box. Looking at the field of players, the only guy that really looks close to that is Paredes. So once again, we really don't have much data to work off of here for this theory. Now, the number of pitches per plate appearance, this was interesting and really took me down a rabbit hole of data, but let's summarize with a few key points. We have to keep in mind the question here is if the batter sees a lot of pitches per plate appearance, are they more likely to get strikes called at a higher rate? To answer this, we will look at the 6 players at the front of the list that we've been talking about this entire video, and we will also look at 6 players with the proper prereqs on the back of this list. We already mentioned McMahon, Rayleigh, and Lau, but I'll also add Nick Castellanos, Cody Bellinger, and Ozzie Albies to balance out these comps. So what are the key metrics to answer this question? Well, definitely pitches per plate appearance. I used the 2023 numbers for this, and I made sure all of them were near 4 pitches per at bat. Next, of the pitches that these batters saw from 22 to 24, what was the ratio of close call pitches? In the StatCast language, that's the shadow of the strike zone. Basically, any pitch where the ball is close to the perimeter of the zone. Lastly, of those close pitches, how many were incorrectly called strikes? By looking at these numbers, we should get some answers. And we do! Check this out. The unlucky players since 2022 have seen close pitches in the neighborhood of 20 to over 25% of the time. Meanwhile, the luckier players range from as low as 13% from Ozzie Albies all the way up to 22% from Ryan McMahon. And when you look at the percentage of incorrectly called strikes on these close pitches, you see a much higher percentage are called strikes for the unlucky players. So this means more close pitches equals more incorrectly called strikes. That tells me, as a pitcher, if you're around the zone more often, you're going to get the call more often than not. But that still leaves an important question. Why are these pitchers around the plate more often to some players rather than others? None of these batters are the Aaron Judges, Juan Sotos, or Shohei Ohtanis of the world. But they're also not the Nick Madrigals of the world either. So why would a pitcher be close to the plate on a guy like Seiya Suzuki, but rarely close with a guy like Ozzie Albies, especially since their slugging percentages in 2023 were within 30 points of each other? Well, when you look at the numbers, that's a pretty easy answer. The bottom 6 that we have highlighted throughout this video have been taking strike one at least 53.1% of the time. Kwon leading the way at 73.2% of the time. But on the other side, the quote-unquote luckier players are not taking strike one even half the time. They're not even coming close. McMahon is the closest at 45.4% of the time, but Castellanos, Albies, Lau, all in 27 to 28% of the time. They're swinging a lot more often on strike one. So if you buy into this theory, the domino effect that happens is as follows. First, the pitcher has a scouting report that shows that the hitter at the plate is passive. They're going to take that first strike more often than not. That pitcher wants to get ahead, so they attack the zone. If they don't get strike one, they're probably still at least close. And then if the following pitches are close and the umpire still has not called a strike, they are likely going to get at least one of those pitches called a strike as a reward for the pitcher being close to the plate. Are you following me on this? If you do, I think it makes a lot of sense, but I want to know what you think. Do you see any similarities of these players that would lead you to think differently? Maybe a new theory? And if you like this video, you will love my video about robo-umps versus the challenge system and how that can be implemented sooner than later. It just popped up on your screen.